On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Delmar Ostrander stood at the edge of his east pasture in Tama County, Iowa, and watched a man from the county assessor's office write down numbers on a clipboard. The man walked the fence line, looked at the rusted hulks arranged in rows across the grass, and wrote down more numbers. He asked Delmar what he called it. Delmar said he called it his equipment yard. The man from the assessor's office looked at the rows again and wrote down something else. Then he got in his car and drove away without saying goodbye. The equipment yard was 11 acres. It held, at that time, 143 pieces of farm machinery in various states of disassembly, ranging from a 1918 Avery steam traction engine with a cracked firebox to a 1979 John Deere 4440 with a seized hydraulic pump. There were planters and cultivators and grain augers and hay balers. There were 3 combines that hadn't moved under their own power since the Carter administration. There were gearboxes stacked like cordwood against the north fence, and PTO shafts hanging from the crossbeams of an open shed, and drawbars leaned against each other in clusters the way old men lean against things when they have nowhere to sit. Delmar had been collecting this equipment since 1966, which was the year his father died and left him the farm and the particular kind of mind that sees a broken thing and thinks, someone will need that someday. By 1987, enough people had decided Delmar was right that he had become, without ever intending to, the most important man in a 40-mile radius for anyone whose machinery had failed them at the worst possible moment. Farmers drove to his pasture from Tama County and Marshall County and Hardin County, and sometimes from as far as Pasture County, which was not close. They came with parts in their truck beds and questions they couldn't answer, and sometimes with nothing but a description of a sound their machine was making. Delmar would listen to the description, walk to wherever the part lived in his 11 acres, and come back with something that fit. He charged what the part was worth to him, which was usually not much and sometimes nothing, and he never turned anyone away in planting season or harvest. This was not generosity exactly. It was more like a philosophy about what a farm community was supposed to be. Let me tell you about Delmar Ostrander, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did, and you need to understand what he did before you can understand why it still matters. Delmar was 61 years old in 1987, which meant he had been farming the same 320 acres in Tama County since he was 22, when his father handed him the keys to a 1952 Oliver 88 and told him not to break it. He was a large man who had gotten smaller with age, the way some large men do, and he wore canvas work pants and a denim jacket regardless of the weather, and a seed cap from a company that had been out of business since 1974. He had hands that looked like they had been carved from something harder than skin. He had been married to the same woman, Loretta, for 38 years, and they had 3 sons, all of whom had left Tama County for reasons Delmar never argued with, and 2 of whom sent money at Christmas and 1 of whom called on Sundays. He did not complain about any of this. He was not a man who complained. He was a man who watched and waited and remembered, and the combination of those 3 things had made him, over 6 decades, into something the county extension office could not have produced if they had tried. He had learned machinery from his father, who had learned it from his father, who had come to Iowa from Ohio in 1901, with a team of horses and a box of tools, and the conviction that a man who understood how things worked would never be entirely helpless. That conviction had passed through 3 generations like a gene, and by the time it reached Delmar, it had become something more specific, a belief that old machines properly maintained, were not inferior to new ones. They were different. They had been designed in an era when the man who built the machine assumed the man who used it would also fix it, which meant they had been built to be understood. The tolerances were wider. The components were accessible. The logic was visible. You could stand next to an old machine and reason your way through it the way you could reason your way through a sentence, following the thought from beginning to end. Modern machines, Delmar believed, had been designed for a different kind of farmer, one who was expected to call the dealer when something went wrong and hand over his credit card and wait. He did not say this often. He thought it constantly. The equipment yard had started as a practical matter. In 1966, when he inherited the farm, he also inherited his father's collection of spare parts and his father's habit of never throwing away anything that might serve a purpose later. The first machine he bought specifically for parts was a 1948 Farmel M with a bent crankshaft, which he purchased from a neighbor for $40 and stripped over the course of a winter. By spring, he had the parts he needed for his own Farmel and enough left over to fill a shelf in the equipment shed. By 1970, he had 2 machines in the East Pasture. By 1975, he had 11. By 1987, he had 143, and the man from the assessor's office was writing numbers on a clipboard, and the county was trying to decide whether what Delmar had built was an equipment yard or a junk yard, which was a distinction that mattered for tax purposes and for something less tangible that Delmar understood perfectly well. He never called it a junk yard. He called it his equipment yard, and the difference was not semantic. A junk yard is where things go to be forgotten. An equipment yard is where things go to wait. Let me tell you about what the equipment yard became, because the story of what it was is only half the story. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the farm economy in central Iowa went through the kind of upheaval that doesn't make the national news, but reshapes communities from the inside out. Land prices had collapsed in the early 80s. Debt that had seemed manageable in 1978 became crushing by 1982. Farms that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations went to the bank. The ones that survived were the ones that found ways to cut costs that the banks and the extension agents and the equipment dealers had not suggested, because the banks and the extension agents and the equipment dealers all had reasons to want farmers spending money. Delmar had no such reason. He wanted his neighbors to survive, and he had concluded, over decades of watching, that one of the most reliable ways to help them survive was to keep their old equipment running instead of forcing them to replace it. This was not a popular position at the dealership in Tama, which was run by a man named Rick Crowley, who had taken over from his father in 1979 and had expanded the operation into a regional dealership with 3 locations and a service department that employed 14 mechanics. Rick Crowley was 44 years old in 1987, which made him 17 years younger than Delmar, and he wore clean clothes and drove a company truck and had opinions about the future of agriculture that he was willing to share with anyone who stood still long enough to hear them. His opinions centered on the idea that modern equipment, properly financed, was the path forward for the serious farmer, and that farmers who clung to old iron were not being thrifty, they were being foolish, because the efficiency gap between a 1965 tractor and a 1987 tractor was large enough that the cost of new equipment paid for itself in productivity. He had numbers to support this. He had brochures. He had a service department that could fix anything, as long as it was under warranty and as long as the parts were still being manufactured. That last qualification was the one that mattered. Let me tell you about the factory, because the factory is the reason this story exists. In 1966, the same year Delmar inherited his farm and began his equipment yard, a company called Midland Implement Manufacturing began producing a line of row crop cultivators from a plant in Marshalltown, Iowa, about 20 miles west of Delmar's farm. The Midland cultivators were not glamorous machines. They were workmanlike and sturdy and designed for the specific conditions of central Iowa row crop farming, which meant they were built with slightly heavier gauge steel than comparable machines from larger manufacturers and with a gang adjustment mechanism that allowed precise calibration to different soil conditions. Farmers in Tama County and Marshall County and Hardin County bought them by the hundreds through the late 1960s and 1970s. They became, in the way that good tools become, invisible, present everywhere, noticed by no one, simply part of how the work got done. Midland Implement Manufacturing was not a large company. It had never been a large company. It survived through the farm crisis of the early 80s by cutting its workforce and its product line, and by 1985 it was producing only the cultivator line and a single model of field cultivator, both of which it sold through a network of regional dealers that included Rick Crowley's operation. In the spring of 1988, Midland's parent company, which had acquired it in 1983 and which was headquartered in a building in Chicago that had never seen a row crop field, decided that the cultivator line was not generating sufficient return on investment and announced that production would cease at the end of the model year. The Marshalltown plant would close. Parts supply would continue for 3 years, after which support would be discontinued. 3 years sounds like a long time. It is not a long time. By 1991, the parts supply had dried up faster than anyone had predicted. The 3-year window had been calculated on the assumption that farmers would begin replacing their Midland cultivators with newer equipment, and some did. But many didn't, because the Midland cultivators worked, and because new cultivators cost money that the farm crisis had made scarce, and because the farmers of Tama County and Marshall County and Hardin County were not in the habit of replacing things that still functioned. So, by the spring of 1991, you had several hundred cultivators in active use across a 3-county area and a parts supply that had been discontinued, and the combination of those two facts created a problem that nobody at the dealership in Tama had a clean answer for. Nobody at the dealership except the parts that were sitting in Delmar Ostrander's East Pasture. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When you hear that a factory closes and parts become unavailable, what do you imagine happens next? You probably imagine that the equipment slowly fails and gets replaced, which is what the manufacturer assumed and what the dealer assumed and what the bank assumed. You probably don't imagine that a 65-year-old farmer in canvas work pants has been quietly accumulating the spare parts for this exact scenario for the past 25 years. Not because he predicted it specifically, but because he understood, in a general and deeply practical way, that factories close and parts disappear and the equipment keeps wearing out regardless. You probably don't imagine that the solution to an industrial supply chain failure is sitting in 11 acres of Iowa pasture, organized in a system that exists entirely inside one man's head. But that is what happened. Let me tell you about the spring of 1991, because that spring is where the story turns. The first farmer to come to Delmar with a Midland cultivator problem was a man named Virgil Hassel, who farmed 480 acres east of Gladbrook, and whose gang adjustment mechanism had sheared a pivot bolt during the first week of cultivation season. Virgil had called the dealer. The dealer had called the parts line. The parts line had been disconnected. Virgil drove to Delmar's place on a Wednesday afternoon, with the broken assembly in his truck bed and the expression of a man who has just discovered that the floor he was standing on is no longer there. Delmar looked at the broken assembly. He looked at it for about 30 seconds. Then he walked into the east pasture and came back 11 minutes later with a pivot bolt that was not identical to the original, but was close enough to work with a 1/4 inch of shimming. He charged Virgil $4. Virgil went home and finished cultivation on schedule. Virgil told 2 neighbors. The neighbors told their neighbors. By the end of May 1991, Delmar had helped 17 farmers with Midland cultivator parts. By the end of the summer, he had helped 31. By the following spring, word had spread far enough that farmers were coming from counties he had never heard of, driving 2 and 3 hours with broken assemblies in their truck beds, and the particular desperation of a man whose equipment is down during planting season. Delmar helped all of them. He charged what the parts were worth to him, which ranged from nothing to $20, and he kept a ledger in the equipment shed that recorded what he had given out, and what he still needed, written in a handwriting that was small and precise and completely illegible to anyone but himself. Rick Crowley heard about this. He heard about it from one of his service managers, who had heard about it from a customer who had bypassed the dealership entirely and driven to Delmar's place instead. Rick drove out to the farm on a Friday afternoon in June of 1991. He parked his truck on the county road and walked to the equipment yard fence and stood there looking at the rows of machinery for a while. Then he found Delmar, who was under a baler adjusting a pickup tine, and told him he needed to talk. The conversation that followed was not long. Rick said that what Delmar was doing was fine as far as it went, but that he was concerned about liability and about farmers using parts that weren't rated for their equipment, and about the message it sent when the community turned to a pasture full of old iron instead of a licensed service department. He said this in the measured, reasonable tone of a man who has prepared what he intends to say. Delmar came out from under the baler and wiped his hands on his work pants and listened to all of it without interrupting. When Rick was finished, Delmar said, "The parts I'm supplying are the same parts that were in these machines when they left the factory. They're not aftermarket. They're not substitutes. They're original components from machines that were identical to the ones I'm fixing." Rick said that wasn't exactly the point. Delmar said he understood that wasn't exactly the point. Then he went back under the baler. Rick drove back to Tama. He told his service manager that Delmar Ostrander was going to create a problem. The service manager, who had grown up in Tama County, and whose father had bought parts from Delmar's father, said he wasn't sure that was right. Let me tell you about the next 4 years, because they are the years that proved who was right. Between 1991 and 1995, Delmar supplied parts for Midland cultivators to farmers across 6 counties. He kept the ledger. He kept track of which parts were going fast and which he still had in abundance, and he made acquisitions accordingly, driving to farm auctions in a 3-county radius and buying stripped Midland machines for whatever the auction crowd would let him have them for, which was usually not much, because the auction crowd had been told by the dealers that Midland equipment was obsolete and not worth buying. Delmar bought them anyway. He paid $60 for a 1973 cultivator at an auction in Toledo and stripped it in a weekend and put the parts on the shelf. He paid $90 for 2 1968 models at an estate sale in Grundy County and got 6 pivot bolt assemblies and 4 gang frames and a complete set of sweeps that he knew were going to be gone within a year. He was right about the sweeps. They were gone in 8 months. The farmers who came to his equipment yard during these years were not just buying parts, they were buying time. A farmer whose cultivator is down during planting season is not losing a piece of equipment. He is losing the window, and the window in central Iowa for row crop cultivation is narrow enough that losing 3 days can mean losing yield, and losing yield in the margin-thin economics of 1990s, corn farming can mean the difference between a year that works and a year that doesn't. Delmar understood this because he had lived it himself, and because his father had lived it, and because his grandfather had lived it, and because the understanding of what a broken machine costs a farmer in planting season was in his bones the way the understanding of soil was in his bones, which was completely and without effort. He turned no one away. In planting, season, and harvest, he worked from before sunrise to after dark, and Loretta kept coffee on the stove and sometimes fed the farmers who came from far away, because she was that kind of woman, and because she had watched her husband build this thing over 25 years and understood what it was. The farmers sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and talked about their equipment and their fields and their debt, and Delmar listened to all of it, and sometimes he had something to say and sometimes he didn't, but he always had the part. Now, let me pause here and ask you something else. You might be wondering where Rick Crowley was during these 4 years. The answer is that he was running his dealership, which was doing fine because there were plenty of farmers buying new equipment and plenty of work for his service department on the machines that were under warranty. He was not thinking about Delmar Ostrander very often. He had decided, after the conversation at the equipment yard fence, that Delmar was a local character who filled a niche that the dealership didn't need to fill, and that the farmers who went to Delmar instead of to him were not the kind of farmers who were going to be buying new equipment anyway. This was a reasonable assessment. It was also wrong, but not in the way you might expect. The farmers who went to Delmar were not the poorest farmers in the county. Some of them were, but many of them were the most careful farmers in the county, the ones who had survived the farm crisis by watching their costs and maintaining their equipment and making decisions based on what they could see in front of them rather than what a dealer's brochure told them they should want. These were the farmers who, when they finally did buy new equipment, bought it based on recommendations from people they trusted. And the people they trusted had been sitting at Delmar Ostrander's kitchen table drinking Loretta's coffee. Let me tell you about the summer of 1995, because that summer is when the thing that had been building for 4 years finally became impossible to ignore. The summer of 1995 was dry in central Iowa. Not drought dry, but dry enough that cultivation timing mattered more than usual, because the window for getting into the field without compacting wet soil was shorter than in a normal year, and the window for getting cultivation done before the crop canopy closed was correspondingly compressed. In a dry year, a farmer whose cultivator is down for a week doesn't lose 3 days. He loses the season. Every farmer in Tama County understood this in June of 1995, and the understanding created a particular kind of urgency that Delmar had seen before and knew how to read. In the 3rd week of June, a pivot bolt assembly on a 1971 Midland cultivator belonging to a farmer named Emmett Bontrager failed in the middle of a field outside of Chelsea. Emmett had 340 acres of corn that needed one more pass. He called the dealer. The dealer had no parts. He called 2 other dealers. They had no parts. He called the manufacturer's old parts line out of habit, knowing it was disconnected, and it was. He drove to Delmar's place on a Tuesday afternoon, and Delmar had the assembly. He had 2 of them. He gave Emmett one and charged him $8, and Emmett was back in the field by Thursday. That same week, 3 other farmers came to Delmar with Midland parts emergencies. He solved all 3. The week after that, 5 more came. He solved 4 of them and told the 5th that he didn't have the specific sweep angle the man needed, but that he could modify a sweep from a 1969 model that would work if the man was willing to run a slightly different attack angle, and the man said yes, and Delmar modified the sweep in his shop in an afternoon, and the man went home and finished cultivation. Word of this reached Rick Crowley through his service manager, who had heard it from 3 different customers in the same week. Rick drove out to the farm again. This time, he didn't stand at the fence. He drove up the lane and knocked on the door, and Loretta let him in and gave him coffee and went to get Delmar from the equipment shed. Delmar came in and sat down across from Rick at the kitchen table, and Rick said he wanted to talk about a business arrangement. He said that what Delmar had was valuable, and that the dealership could help him monetize it. He said he could connect Delmar with farmers across a wider area, handle the transactions professionally, provide liability coverage, and give Delmar a percentage of the sales. He said it in the tone of a man who is offering something generous. Delmar drank his coffee. He said, "What percentage?" Rick said 30%. Delmar said, "Of what price?" Rick said the dealership would set the price based on market value for the parts. Delmar said, "Who determines market value when there's no market?" Rick didn't have a clean answer for that. Delmar said he appreciated the thought and that he'd think about it. Rick drove back to Tama. Delmar did not call him. Let me tell you about what Delmar understood that Rick Crowley did not, because it is the most important thing in this story, and it is not about parts. Delmar understood that what he had built in 11 acres of East Iowa pasture was not a parts business. It was a relationship. The farmers who came to his equipment yard were not customers. They were neighbors, and the word neighbor meant something specific in Tama County in 1995 that it did not mean in a dealership brochure. It meant that when Virgil Hassel's cultivator broke in planting season, Delmar gave him a part for $4, not because $4 was the market price, but because $4 was what the part had cost Delmar and what Virgil could afford and what the relationship required. It meant that when Emmett Bontrager drove 40 minutes to his farm in a dry June with 340 acres waiting, Delmar was not going to make him fill out paperwork or wait for a liability waiver or accept a 30% markup that would go to a dealership in Tama. It meant that the equipment yard existed inside a web of mutual obligation that had been woven over 25 years, and that could not be converted into a business arrangement without destroying the thing that made it work. Rick Crowley was not a bad man. He was a businessman, and he looked at what Delmar had built and saw inventory and margin and market reach, because those were the categories his mind used. Delmar had built it with different categories: obligation, patience, memory, and the particular kind of pride that comes from being useful to people who need you. The arrangement Rick proposed would have made Delmar more money. It would have made the parts available to more farmers. And it would have turned the equipment yard into something that was no longer the equipment yard, which was the one thing Delmar was not willing to do. So he didn't call. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because they are the years that made Delmar Ostrander into something larger than himself. By 1997, the Midland cultivators that were still running in Tama County and the surrounding counties were running because of parts that had come from Delmar's equipment yard. This is not an exaggeration. The original part supply had been exhausted. The aftermarket alternatives that existed were of inconsistent quality and required modification to fit. The only source of original specification Midland components within a reasonable distance was 11 acres of pasture outside of Tama, maintained by a man who had been collecting those components since before some of the farmers who depended on them had been born. Delmar had, through patience and foresight and the willingness to buy things nobody else wanted, made himself indispensable to an entire generation of row crop farmers in a way that no business plan had ever contemplated. He kept the ledger. He kept buying at auctions. He drove to an estate sale in Benton County in the fall of 1997 and paid $45 for a 1970 Midland cultivator that was missing its sweeps but had a complete and functional gang adjustment assembly, which he needed badly because the gang adjustment assemblies were the component that failed most often and that he was running lowest on. He stripped the machine over a weekend. He put the assembly on the shelf. He noted it in the ledger. Loretta kept the coffee on. The farmers kept coming. In 1998, a reporter from the Tama County newspaper came out to write a story about the equipment yard. She was 23 years old and had grown up in Cedar Rapids and had never been on a working farm, and she walked the rows of machinery with a notebook and asked Delmar questions he had never been asked before, like how he knew where everything was and how he had decided to start collecting and whether he had ever thought about what would happen to it all when he was gone. Delmar answered the first two questions patiently. He said he knew where everything was because he had put it there and he remembered where he put things, which was not a method he could explain more specifically than that. He said he had started collecting because his father had taught him that a broken thing is not a worthless thing. The third question he did not answer directly. He said that was something he thought about. The reporter wrote her story, and it ran on the front page of the Tama County paper and was picked up by the Des Moines Register, which ran a shorter version on the farm page, and for about 3 weeks, Delmar got calls from people he didn't know, asking questions he found difficult to answer, and then it stopped, and things went back to the way they had been. But the story had done something that Delmar had not anticipated. It had reached farmers in counties he had never served, farmers who had Midland equipment and parts problems and who had assumed there was no solution. They started calling. They started driving. By 1999, Delmar was serving farmers from 8 counties, and the equipment yard had grown to 14 acres because he had bought the adjoining field from a neighbor who was retiring, and the ledger had grown to 4 volumes, and Delmar was 73 years old and getting up before sunrise every day to work. Now, let me pause here and ask you one more thing. You might be wondering whether Rick Crowley ever came back. He did. He came back in the fall of 1999, and this time he did not knock on the door. He drove up the lane and found Delmar in the equipment yard, standing between 2 rows of stripped cultivators, and he stood there for a moment before he spoke. He said he owed Delmar an apology. He said that in 1995 he had come out here and proposed something that was about his business and not about what Delmar was actually doing, and that he understood now that those were different things. He said he had watched for 4 years as his service department turned away farmer after farmer with Midland parts problems, and that every one of those farmers had driven to Delmar's place and come back with what they needed, and that he had finally accepted that there was something happening here that his dealership was not equipped to replicate. Delmar listened to all of this. Then he said, "I know you came out here in 1995 thinking I had something you could use, and I know you're coming out here now thinking I have something you need." He said it without heat, the way you state a fact. Rick said that was fair. Delmar said, "The difference between those two things is the whole story." Rick stood there for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" Delmar said he needed Rick to stop telling farmers that old equipment was obsolete, because obsolete was a word that meant something only if you had somewhere to go instead, and a lot of his farmers didn't have somewhere to go instead. Rick said he could do that. Delmar said, "Good." And that was the end of the conversation. It was not a dramatic reconciliation. It was two men standing between rows of old iron on a fall afternoon in Iowa, reaching an understanding that had taken 8 years to arrive. Delmar went back to what he was doing. Rick drove back to Tama. But something had changed, and the change was permanent. Rick Crowley's dealership became, over the following years, a place that referred farmers with old equipment problems to Delmar rather than dismissing those problems as unsolvable. The service manager, whose father had bought parts from Delmar's father, had been doing this quietly for years already. Now it was official. Let me tell you about the winter of 2003, because that winter is the part of the story that does not have a clean resolution. Delmar was 77 years old in the winter of 2003. He had been farming his 320 acres and running his equipment yard for 37 years, and the equipment yard now held 211 pieces of machinery in 14 acres of East Iowa pasture, and the ledger had grown to 7 volumes, and Loretta had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure in the spring and was not well. Delmar kept working. He kept the ledger. He kept the coffee on when farmers came, though he made it himself now because Loretta couldn't stand at the stove for long. He did not complain about any of this. His son, Gerald, the one who called on Sundays, drove up from Kansas City in November and spent a week on the farm. He walked the equipment yard with his father and looked at the 211 pieces of machinery and the 7-volume ledger and the system that existed entirely inside his father's head. And he understood, in the way that sons sometimes understand things too late, that what he was looking at was irreplaceable. Not the parts. The parts were valuable, but parts could be cataloged and priced and sold. What was irreplaceable was the knowledge of what each part was, where it had come from, what it fit, and what modification it required to fit something it hadn't been designed for. That knowledge had been built over 37 years and lived in one place, and that place was his father's mind. Gerald asked his father if he had ever written any of it down. Delmar said he had the ledger. Gerald said the ledger recorded transactions. He meant the other knowledge, the knowledge of which sweep from a 1969 model could be modified to fit a 1971 assembly, and how and what the modification required. Delmar thought about this for a moment. He said, "I know where it all is." Gerald said, "I know you do." He didn't say the rest, which was, "But what happens when you don't?" Delmar understood what Gerald wasn't saying. He had understood it for years. He had simply not known what to do about it, because the knowledge was not the kind of knowledge that transferred easily to paper. It was the kind of knowledge that transferred through watching and doing, through standing next to a machine while someone who understood it showed you what they saw, through years of handling the same components until your hands knew them the way your eyes knew faces. He had tried to teach it to his sons, but his sons had left, and the farmers who came to his equipment yard came with problems, not with time to learn. There had been no apprentice. There had been no one to stand next to him in the rows of old iron and learn what he knew the way he had learned it from his father. This was the thing that kept Delmar awake at night in the winter of 2003, and he was not a man who was kept awake by things easily. Gerald went back to Kansas City in December. He called on Sundays. Loretta died in February of 2004, quietly in the bedroom they had shared for 55 years, and Delmar buried her in the churchyard in Tama and came home and made himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The farmers came in spring with their parts problems, and he helped them. He kept the ledger. He kept working. Let me tell you about the spring of 2006, because that spring is where the story finds something that looks like hope, though hope is not quite the right word. A young man named Silas Vandermeer showed up at the equipment yard on a Saturday morning in April of 2006. He was 24 years old and had grown up in Marshall County and had studied agricultural mechanics at Iowa State, and had come home to help his father farm, and had heard about Delmar Ostrander from his father, who had bought parts from Delmar twice in the 1990s. Silas had a Midland cultivator problem, which was how most conversations with Delmar started. But after Delmar solved the problem, Silas didn't leave. He stood in the equipment yard and looked at the rows of machinery and asked Delmar if he could come back. He said he wanted to learn. He said he had studied agricultural mechanics, but that what he had studied was mostly modern equipment, and that he thought what Delmar knew about old equipment was something that wasn't being taught anywhere, and that he wanted to know it. Delmar looked at him for a long moment. He said, "Come back next Saturday. Bring work clothes." Silas came back next Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. By June, he was coming twice a week. By August, he was coming every day that he wasn't needed on his father's farm, which was most days in August. He was a good learner. He was patient, which Delmar considered the first requirement, and he was not too proud to be wrong, which Delmar considered the second. He learned to read the ledger, which required Delmar to teach him the handwriting, which required Delmar to slow down and think about what he had written in a way he never had before. He learned which parts from which machines were interchangeable and which required modification, and how to perform the modifications. He learned the system of the equipment yard, which was not alphabetical or chronological or organized by any principle that could be written down, but which had its own logic that Silas learned by walking the rows with Delmar every morning until the logic became visible to him the way it had always been visible to Delmar. It took 2 years. By the spring of 2008, Silas Vandermeer could walk into the equipment yard with a description of a broken part and find what was needed without help. He couldn't do it in 11 minutes, the way Delmar could. It took him 25 or 30 minutes, but he could do it, and he could do the modification if modification was needed, and he kept his own ledger alongside Delmar's, which was more legible and which included notes that Delmar's ledger had never had room for. Delmar was 82 years old in 2008. He was slower than he had been, but he was still working, and he still knew where everything was, and he still turned no one away in planting season. He watched Silas work and said very little, which was how he taught, and Silas understood this and did not need to be told things twice. Let me tell you about the fall of 2008, because that fall is the last chapter of the main story and the first chapter of the one that follows. In October of 2008, Delmar Ostrander had a stroke in the equipment yard. He was between the rows of stripped cultivators, the same rows where he had stood with Rick Crowley 9 years earlier, and he went down between a 1972 Midland and a 1968 International Harvester and lay there in the October grass until Silas found him 40 minutes later. Silas called the ambulance. They took Delmar to the hospital in Marshalltown, which was the same city where the Midland factory had stood, and where the factory building was now a distribution center for a company that sold goods that had nothing to do with farming. Delmar did not die from the stroke. He lost the use of his left hand and some of his speech, and he came home from the hospital in November and sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and watched through the window as Silas worked the equipment yard. The farmers came with their parts problems, and Silas solved them. And when Silas wasn't sure, he came inside and asked Delmar, and Delmar told him with the words he still had, which were fewer than before, but sufficient. By December, Silas was solving most of the problems without asking. By spring, he was solving all of them. Delmar sat at the kitchen table and watched through the window and drank his coffee. He was not unhappy. He had been afraid, in the winter of 2003, that the knowledge would die with him, and it had not died. It had transferred, imperfectly and incompletely, but sufficiently, into a 26-year-old man from Marshall County who came to the equipment yard every day and kept the ledger and turned no one away in planting season. The method of transfer had been the same method by which the knowledge had come to Delmar in the first place. Standing next to a machine while someone who understood it showed you what they saw. His father had stood next to him. He had stood next to Silas. That was how it worked, and it had always been how it worked, and the fact that it had nearly stopped working was the thing that had kept him awake in the winter of 2003, and the fact that it had not stopped was the thing that let him sleep now. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end in 2008, and it doesn't end with Delmar in the kitchen window. Delmar Ostrander died in March of 2012, in the same bedroom where Loretta had died 8 years before. He was 86 years old. Gerald drove up from Kansas City, and his 2 brothers came from wherever they were, and they buried Delmar in the churchyard next to Loretta and went back to the farm and stood in the kitchen and drank coffee and looked at the equipment yard through the window. The 7-volume ledger was on the shelf. Silas Vandermeer was in the equipment yard when they arrived, working on a stripped cultivator frame, and he came inside and sat with the sons and drank coffee and told them what their father had been doing for the last 4 years of his life, which was watching through the window and answering questions with the words he still had and being, in a quieter way than before, still useful. Gerald asked Silas what he intended to do. Silas said he intended to keep doing what he'd been doing, if the family would allow it. Gerald looked at his brothers. His brothers looked at the equipment yard through the window. Gerald said, "We'd appreciate that. Silas Vandermeer runs the equipment yard today. He is in his early 40s now, which means he has been working it for nearly 20 years. And the equipment yard has grown to 16 acres and holds 247 pieces of machinery, and the ledger has grown to 11 volumes, and Silas has his own apprentice, a young woman named Paige Johansson from Tama County, who is 22 years old and studying agricultural history at Iowa State, and who comes to the equipment yard on weekends and learns the system the same way Silas learned it, which is the same way Delmar learned it, which is the same way Delmar's father learned it, by walking the rows with someone who knows where everything is and why. The Midland cultivators are still running. Not all of them. The ones that have failed beyond repair have been stripped and their parts have gone onto the shelf, which is how the equipment yard works, which is how it has always worked. But many of them are still in fields in Tama County, and Marshall County, and Hardin County, and 5 other counties, still doing the work they were designed to do in the 1960s and 1970s, still running because a man in canvas work pants bought broken machines at auction for $40 and $60 and $90 when nobody else wanted them, and put the parts on a shelf in 11 acres of Iowa pasture and kept a ledger and turned no one away in planting season. Rick Crowley retired in 2015. At his retirement dinner, which was held at the VFW Hall in Tama, he gave a speech about the farm economy and the changes he had seen in 36 years of running a dealership. Near the end of the speech, he said something that people who were there still remember. He said that the most important lesson he had learned in his career was that he had not always known what valuable looked like. He said that for a long time he had thought valuable was new and expensive and warranted, and that he had learned, slowly and not without resistance, that some of the most valuable things he had ever seen were sitting in a pasture outside of town, rusting in the rain, waiting for someone to need them. He did not say Delmar's name. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew whose pasture he meant. Paige Johansson drove out to the equipment yard on the morning after Rick Crowley's retirement dinner and told Silas what Rick had said. Silas was in the rows, looking for a sweep assembly, and he listened without stopping. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Delmar would have said, 'That's about right.'" Paige asked how he knew what Delmar would have said. Silas said, "Because I asked him once what he thought about people who only understood something after they didn't need to understand it anymore." He said Delmar had looked at him for a moment and then said, "They're the majority. Don't hold it against them." Paige wrote this down in her notebook. She writes most things down. Delmar would have approved of that. The equipment yard sits on 16 acres of East Iowa pasture in Tama County, and it is maintained by a man in his early 40s and a young woman in her early 20s. And the ledger is on the shelf in the equipment shed, and the coffee is on in the farmhouse kitchen, and the farmers still come with broken parts and descriptions of sounds their machines are making. Silas listens to the descriptions. He walks into the rows. He comes back with something that fits. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. And some men spend their whole lives building something the world won't understand until they're gone, and the lucky ones find someone to stand next to before it's